We're continuing on in the book of Acts tonight, and we're going to see some of the groups of people that Paul has to deal with. We've dealt so much with the Jews and all their doctrines and traditions and everything. Now we're going to deal with a lot of the Gentiles and all their philosophies, because you'll find it's very similar to today. And that's what we're doing this for. These were the first followers. And then Paul came along not long after, as one of them as well, showing us how this movement can work if we're flying with Yahusha. This one's all about religious tolerance. The world's pumping this whole thing about religious tolerance. It all came back here. Babylon, remember the beasts? Babylon, there were a few others, and then it came to Rome. Roman religious tolerance. This is what Paul's dealing with. This would be a good time to explain the issue at the heart of the upsetment surrounding Paul wherever he went. Always upsetting everybody wherever he went. This was Paul. Why? The Roman Empire, and we're not talking Vatican Pope here, we're talking soldiers. Hail Caesar. The Roman Empire had a policy of religious tolerance. In general, anyone could worship their local deities or idols without interference. So the Jews were also free to worship their Elohim, to build synagogues, etc. But what no one was permitted to do was create disturbances or to challenge the authority of Roman law or local magistrates, and especially challenge the supremacy of the Roman emperor. Not on. To put it another way, while there was plenty of religious tolerance, worship whatever the hell you like, there was no political tolerance. You serve the Caesar and the government, and that's it. The Jews represented a particularly troublesome problem for the Romans. They were unlike any other ethnic group in that they tended to stay true to their religion and to their ethnic identity, because the Jews considered those two aspects of Jewish life as inseparable. And the Jews, while appreciative of the tolerance shown to them, were themselves not at all tolerant towards the pagan religions that represented the majority of the citizens of the empire. Remember, we're reading this from the point of view of the Romans here, because we don't have much tolerance for the worldly beliefs either, because Yahusha hates them. But I'm looking at this from the point of view of the Romans, so we can understand what's coming at Paul. The more pious among the diaspora Jews, that just means a Jew that was born outside of Israel, the more pious among the diaspora Jews showed open contempt for the deities of the many pagan religions that they lived among. They also tended to refuse participation in the national festivals, we understand that invariably involved Roman or Greek gods and goddesses, festivals that were intended to unite the smorgasbord of peoples and nations that formed the Roman Empire. The Jews also favoured creating ghettos and boroughs where they would practice their unique Jewish lifestyle, shunning the local and national traditions and observances. Because of their Babylonian exile some 600 years earlier, the Jews had scattered far and wide, mostly of their own accord, but most of them did not assimilate into the Gentile world, although some did to varying degrees. Jews therefore remained quite identifiable, which was their intent. So while the Romans were busily trying to institute a universal Hellenistic pagan Greek culture throughout their empire, the Jews led the way in resisting it. The Jews had entirely different moral standards. They educated their children differently and conducted their lives differently. This made them visibly separate and distinct from the many other ethnic groups. Think of it this way. It's similar today, where we have growing immigrant populations of Muslims who wear their own particular garb, clothing. They meet at mosques, eat only halal foods, usually prefer to speak Arabic or Farsi and some other unfamiliar Middle Eastern dialect, and tend to take over certain areas of cities in order to cluster together, generally refusing assimilation. National principles of religious freedoms always allow them to worship their unique deities, but that doesn't mean we're entirely comfortable with it, does it? it bothers society in general that they don't seem to want to be one of us. Rather, they want to import their culture to our nation, or even try to change us to their ways. Provided these people stay to themselves and don't start trouble, we tolerate them. But when something unsettling happens involving Muslims, it ups the level of our suspicion, doesn't it? And lowers our level of acceptance of them as a group. And this is exactly how the Jews were viewed in the Roman Empire. This is how the Romans saw the Jews. Extreme groups doing their own thing, causing trouble. Now, as concerns Paul and his merry band of followers, they represented a unique problem again. They didn't just bother the local Gentiles, like the other Jews did. They also rolled up the local Jews as well. So it's not that the Gentiles understood. We have to understand this. It's not that the Gentiles didn't understand what Paul was embracing by the local Jews, but rejected by others. They weren't at all familiar with the intricacies and nuances of Torah. Gentiles didn't know anything about Torah. All they knew is that this particular group of travelling Jews caused upsetment wherever they went because, as we know, Yahusha brings a sword. And when they upset the local Jews, get this, the local Jews upset the local Gentiles. When the local Jews and Gentiles together began forming a mob to take action against Paul and the local believers, this upset the local Roman authorities, who were always on the lookout for rebellion. And when the Roman authorities got upset, the local politicians feared for their jobs. And when the local politicians feared for their jobs, they looked for someone to blame. And so they blamed those that seemed to be the source of the problem, the Jews. So, bottom line, for the Gentiles and for the Roman authorities, this wasn't about religion. Got that? That's the main point of this. They weren't angry at Paul and the Jews because of the worship whatever you like. Stop causing trouble, causing riots. People were going mad everywhere. How could you not? Wasn't Yahusha the same? What did people do around him? How can you not have a riot when there's demons flying out of people and people are being freed? And but this is how the Romans saw it. This was about political and civil unrest. And of course, when we read the Gentiles think that Paul is declaring Yahusha to be a king who is in defiance of the emperor of Rome, they can't make the distinction between his meaning this in a divine sense versus their paranoid thinking that he means in a political sense. This is probably the most serious allegation of all, because to the average citizen, this seems like sedition. So when they heard these charges, they joined the mob in being perturbed, because if they didn't do something about it, they could be accused of being complicit. This was essentially the same charge that had been levelled at Paul and company at Philippi, the charge that resulted in jail because he was causing trouble, apparently. Of course, everyone knew that this charge was nonsense. After all, the supposed rival king, Yahusha, had been executed some 15 years earlier. So what are they worried about him for? He's not even around, they think. So it was mere thought. So it was the mere thought of some Jews wanting a king that might challenge the emperor. That was the issue. It was words and thoughts that simply could not be uttered, no matter how remote or benign the reality of it. It was essentially the ultimate political incorrectness. But for these travelling Jews to be the ones to say those words, that made them little more than travelling troublemakers. According to Rome, of course. So you understand from Rome's point of view now why they're so angry at Paul? Not because of what he's teaching, but because of what happens around him. He's upsetting the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews don't accept Yahusha and the Gentiles don't know about anything. So they're all having this violent reaction. But this is all according to Rome. And what do we know about Rome from the other night?
Part of the beast.
It's a beast. So Paul's dealing, living, working, ministering in a beast system. Just like we are today. So it's probably important to see how he behaves and handles situations. Last week in Acts 16, we saw that Paul and Silas were arrested in the town of Philippi and thrown in jail, accused of starting a riot. It took a miraculous supernatural action of Yahusha, an earthquake, to free them before any permanent harm was done to them. Remember that chapter? the jailer was going to kill himself, but he got immersed, his whole family. Let's get into Acts 17. Paul and Silas travelled through the cities of Amphipolis and Apollonia. They came to the cities of Thessalonica, and there was a Jewish synagogue. Paul went into the synagogue to see the Jews, as he always did. The next 3 weeks, on each Shabbat day, he reasoned the ancient scriptures with them. 3 weeks in a row, on the Shabbat he's there, reasoning with them. Paul immediately went to the local synagogues, because that's where he would find Torah-obedient brothers who'd offer hospitality to him. They already believed in the Creator, so he shared with them that Yahusha was the promised deliverer spoken of by the prophets. A bit more hospitable, they would understand his belief. A bit more. Paul explained the scriptures to show them all that the Messiah had to suffer and die, but then rise from the dead. He said, this Yahusha that I'm telling you about is the promised deliverer and Messiah. Remember, he's still talking to Jews here. They didn't know who Yahusha was. Some of the Jews there believed Paul and Silas and decided to join them. Also, a large number of Greeks who were worshippers of the true Elohim Yahuwah, and many important women joined them. But the Jews who did not believe became jealous and envious. So they got some wicked men from around the city centre to make trouble. Couldn't just let him go his way. They had to get a mob and cause trouble. They formed a mob and caused a riot in the city. So is this really Paul's fault? Or is this the Jews? They formed a mob and caused a riot in the city. They went to Jason's house looking for Paul and Silas. They wanted to bring them out before the people. When they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the other believers to the city leaders. The people shouted, these men who have turned the world upside down, turned the whole world upside down, have now come here too. And as we know, it's really the power of Yahushua's name through active behaviour that turns the world upside down. These men have turned the world upside down, and now they're here too. Jason is keeping them in his house. They all do things against the laws of Caesar. They say there is another king called Yahusha. What did we just read? That's not going to go down with the Roman government, is it? There's another king. When the city leaders and the other people heard this, they became very upset. They made Jason and the other believers deposit money to guarantee that there would be no more trouble. Like a fine, they fined him money. Then they let him go. That same night, the believers sent Paul and Silas to another city named Berea. When they arrived there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. The people in Berea were more open-minded than those in Thessalonica. They were so glad to hear the message Paul told them. They studied the scriptures every day to make sure that what they heard was really true. The result was that many of them believed, including many important Greek women and men. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was telling people Yahushua's message in Berea, they came there too. They were upset. They upset the people. They upset the people and made trouble. Making a lot of trouble, these Jews, aren't they? So the believers immediately sent Paul away to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed in Berea. Those who went with Paul took him to the city of Athens. So that was Berea up there. Berea's up here. Thessalonica. Israel's down here somewhere. So they're all the way up here. Paul's off to Athens now. That's Greece. They returned with a message for Silas and Timothy to come and join him as soon as they could. While Paul was waiting for Silas and Timothy in Athens, he was upset. This is Paul. Paul is upset because he saw that the city was full of idols. In the synagogue, he talked with the Jews and with the Greeks who were worshippers of the true Elohim Yahuwah. He also went to the public square every day and talked with everyone who came by. So we're going to see that there was a pantheon of gods that Paul has to deal with. Athens was a unique place. He's going to spend a bit of time in Athens now. This is what he has to deal with. Athens was a very unique place. It was considered the birthplace of democracy and the seat of intellectualism. It is what today we might call a college town. But it was also a Greek city, not a Roman city, and so they enjoyed a special status that exempted them from the Roman provincial system. All Paul saw was the myriad of idols placed all over the city, and it greatly offended him. For Yahuwah's second commandment specifically addressed this issue and forbade having anything to do with idols. Now, Paul had seen idols in cities since he was a child. He was, after all, a diaspora Jew, a Jew born outside of Israel. He was born and raised in Tarsus, Cilicia. But Athens was a veritable garden of idols, and Paul could barely control his outrage. Depending on how pious a Jew thought of himself, many would not even pass through the gates of the city. What about this? They wouldn't even pass through the gates of the city that were adorned with welcome idols. Going into a city is seeing idols everywhere. He wouldn't even go into the city, those that were serious about it. And they wouldn't carry or even touch a coin if it had a likeness or image on it. And most coins did. Paul might not have been this radically zealous, but he was greatly troubled and agitated by what he saw in Athens. Do we feel this way when we look around us? Is the idolatry any different today in the world? It's not. Some of the Epicurean and some of the Stoic philosophers, so he's in Greece now, so everybody's very Stoic and intellectual, you see. You've got the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers arguing with him, saying this ridiculous babbler doesn't really know what he's talking about. What's he trying to say? Well, he's just speaking a simple gospel message, and they're all intellectual. You know, what's this peasant saying to us? Paul was giving them the good news about Yahusha and the resurrection. So they said, he seems to be telling us about some other deities. They don't even know anything. These Epicurean and the Stoics, Paul also encountered a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers who listened to what he said in the streets of Athens. But because they considered themselves as the intellectual elite, they considered him but a babbler. Remember, everything Paul's going through, we will encounter different people, religious people, people who think they're clever and smart, intellectual and knowledge people. They thought he was just a crazy babbler. Let's understand what Epicureans and Stoics were and what they believed, because it will help us to understand why Paul approaches them the way he does. First, understand that these two groups were rivals. So our first clue is that whatever philosophies were named after their founder, Epicurus, who lived 3 centuries earlier, they denied the existence of an all-powerful, purposeful creator. These intellectuals denied the existence of an all-powerful, purposeful creator and claimed that the universe was created spontaneously and all that existed was purely the result of mathematical chance. Does that sound familiar? In fact, they had no regard for the Greek and Roman deity systems and expressed contempt toward the idols and all the temples and priests and flocks of followers. Essentially, outside of a never-ending search for knowledge, there was nothing worth living for. It's all they lived for, search for knowledge, enlightenment. And so when a Stoic reached a point in which they either physically or mentally could not gain more knowledge, or they had lost any interest in learning more, then the only reasonable and logical solution was suicide. Nothing more to live for. I don't want to learn anymore. It's all about learning knowledge. Might as well kill myself. Their founder took this path, and many thousands of Stoics did as well. This is where Paul is over here in Athens. Both Stoicism and Epicureanism find scriptural belief systems to be childish, fantasy and illogical. Don't we see that on the news every day? Anybody who might come forward or might be on the news with a scriptural based belief, no matter what they are, they're pretty much laughed at. They're talked down to. That's ridiculous. 6,000-year-old earth, what's wrong with you? You know, we're idiots for believing that. Both these people, groups of people, were the same. Childish, fantasy and illogical. So can you see this scholarly intellectualism going on all around us today? It's still the same. They don't go by the same names, but the underlying principles remain. And what these principles bring to humanity is a hopeless existence with a hopeless future. In the modern era, the European Enlightenment of the 18th century adopted these same beliefs, just in new packaging, with the goal of eradicating religion. So the intellectuals wanted to eradicate religion that contained any sort of mysticism from European society. The main targets were Christianity and Judaism. It was largely succeeded too. In contemporary 21st century times, this same goal to abolish religion is called secularism. Secularism. Or we speak of it politically as liberal progressive ideals. So what Paul was confronted with in Athens, 1st century AD, followers of Yahushua today are also confronted with. But Paul did not back down. And he said in 2 Corinthians, do not yoke yourselves together with unbelievers. So Paul wasn't trying to reason with them. He wasn't trying to please them, find some middle ground with these people. There's no middle ground. Look what he says here. Don't yoke yourself together with unbelievers. How can righteousness and lawlessness be partners? What fellowship does light have with darkness? Where's the middle ground you can find in that? There's none. Where's the compromise? There's none. What harmony can there be between the Messiah and the devil? What does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement can there be between the temple of Yahushua and idols? For we are the temple of the living Elohim. As Yahushua said, I will house myself in them and I will walk among you. Didn't we feel that tonight? He walks among us. And they will be my people. Therefore, Yahuwah says, go out from their midst, separate yourselves. Don't even touch what is unclean. Then I myself will receive you. How do you get received? To separate yourself. Don't touch what is unclean. Then I myself will receive you. In fact, I will be your father, and you will be my sons and daughters, says Yahuwah of hosts. Paul wrote all these scriptures, and now we're seeing why. There's a lot more stuff that I found that went along with this, but it's too much. In contrast with where he was and what he wrote and why he wrote it. You see the experience he has, and then he writes something to people. He has an experience and he writes something. And we're at the stage now where we're seeing everything he's going through, so that when, maybe after Acts, we come to the other books, we'll understand why he's saying what he's saying, because we've seen what he's gone through and the people he's talking to. So, he's dealing with complete secular humanists that don't believe and they think he's just a joke. They took Paul to a meeting of the Areopagus Council. They said, please explain to us this new idea that you have been teaching. Because they love new ideas, don't they? All into ideas. Tell us this new idea you've been teaching. The things you are saying are new to us. We have never heard this teaching before, and we want to know what it means. The people of Athens and the foreigners who lived there spent all their time either telling or listening to all the latest ideas. It's just information to them. Then Paul stood up before the meeting of the Areopagus Council? Areopagus Council. How do you say that?
Areopagus.
Areopagus. Stood up before the Areopagus Council and said, men of Athens, everything I see here tells me you are very religious. I was going through your city and I saw the things you worship. I found an altar that had these words written on it, to an unknown deity. So he's got all these altars everywhere. In the middle of it all, there's an altar that just said, to an unknown deity. You worship a deity that you don't even know. What's that about? This is the true living Elohim that I want to tell you about. He is the mighty Elohim who created the whole world and everything in it. He is the creator of the land and the sky. He does not live in temples built by human hands. He's the one who gives people life, breath, and everything else they need. He does not need any help from them. He has everything he needs. Yahuwah began by making one man, and from him he made all the different people who live everywhere in the world. He decided exactly when and where they would live too. Notice he's not going back quoting Torah verses or in a scripture or telling them the history of Abraham. They're not Jews. They don't care. They're intellectuals. So he's telling them a very simple summary little package, isn't it? Talks about the beginning of the world, everything in it. This creator, there's a creator that's actually real, not an unknown one. You can know him. So he's dealing with these people in a different way. They didn't want some foreigner bringing their beliefs into Greek society. We find this same dynamic at play today amongst atheists, who are by definition secular and liberal. They are the Stoics of our day. They don't believe that a creator exists. Yet you or I can't worship Yahusha because that makes them feel threatened, they say. How can they feel threatened by Yahusha if he's no more than a fantasy to them? How can they be threatened by something that you don't believe exists? So just as liberal secularists today take scripture followers to court to stop us from worshipping Yahusha, so did the Stoics, Epicureans, take Paul to court to stop him from worshipping Yahusha. It doesn't exist, they say. See how insane it is? Remember, Paul's goal isn't to argue their philosophies as much as it is to have a stage to speak the truth of the gospel to these pagans. And so Paul begins to explain just who Yahusha is. At first, nothing Paul is saying offends the audience. That is because he is but imparting new and interesting information. They love information. First thing Paul does is explain the sovereignty of Yahusha over all things. And he does this by making the logical argument that since Yahusha created all things, including life itself, he is superior and above all things, especially above man-made things. Therefore, it would be inappropriate for Yahusha to live in temples fashioned by human workmanship. Yahusha can't be coddled and served with the finest things of earth because he doesn't need humans or anything whatsoever. Yahusha is the epitome of self-reliance. He's the creator of the heavens and earth. Paul's continuing on with his speech here. Yahuwah wanted people to look for him, and perhaps in searching all around for him, they would find him. But he is not far away. He is not far from any of us. He says that, but he's not far from any of us. Where is he? In our hearts. He's in a different dimension, right here. It is through him that we are able to live, to do what we said, to do what we do. It is through him that we are able to live, to do what we do, and to be who we are. As your own poets have said, we all come from him. That's right. We do all come from Yahuwah. So you must not think that he is like something people imagine or make. He is not made of gold, silver or stone. This is interesting. He's quoting the own poets in Athens. Several things Paul says to the Athenians are taken directly from a source that these Greeks would recognise. He quotes from Epiphanides and then Aratus. So Paul is not so much building a case yet against the Greek deities as he is building a case of how Yahusha is to be properly characterised and worshipped, not like they are with the idolatry. In the past, people did not understand Yahuwah, and he overlooked this. We noticed all of that in Genesis. Yahuwah wasn't really coming in on them and telling them not to worship idols in Genesis. He overlooked this in the past. But now, he is telling everyone in the world to change and turn to him, repent. For he has decided on a day when he will judge all people in the world in a way that is fair. And as we know, it will be with fire. To do this, he will use a man he chose long ago. And he's proven to everyone that this is the man to do it by raising him from the dead. These are fighting words because Paul is telling these highly educated Athenians that their centuries-old idol system is actually ignorance, and it amounts to sin from which they must turn away. These thoughts were foreign to any Greek way of thinking, for the only nation, this is interesting, the only nation that had a tradition of a coming day of worldwide judgment by an Elohim was the Hebrew nation. Only religion, only belief system that has end time, Armageddon type situation. Considering who he was dealing with, the very first thing that the Athenians had to learn was to turn away from idols. And Luke says that what brought many of the crowd to the boiling point was this issue of resurrection, because many of them didn't believe in resurrection. And when the people heard about Yahushua being raised from the dead, some of them laughed, but others said, "We'll hear more about this from you later." So Paul left the council meeting. But some of the people joined with Paul and became believers. So he still got some people out of it, didn't he? He still affected some people. Among these were Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus Council, a woman named Damaris, and some others. Nothing is made of Paul's Jewishness here. They're not teasing him because he's Jewish, teasing him because he's believing. He's not to what they would consider intellectualism. There seems to be no ethnic bigotry going on here. In fact, Paul was given a pretty fair and respectful hearing. No doubt it was helpful that Paul spoke fluent Greek. But then again, so did most Jews in that era, Jews who lived in the diaspora. So that's the scripture tonight. We can see Paul interacting and experiencing the world in the exact same way that we do. Some chats are mildly pleasant, most not. Others are downright abusive. Navigating the world is smoother some days than others. But the three rules are a great help to not get stung any day. And Paul is an example. Paul is an example to us in the way he tailored the same foundational message of deliverance and heart operation to all different sorts of people. He tailored it in different ways depending on who he was talking to. Some people he brings scripture in, some people he spoke very general, almost new agey cosmically, because that's what they believed. He's talking to them on their level. Did it to all different sorts of people. He knew what package would work for each type, and essentially he was listening to Yahushua. And that's the key to this supernatural experience. That is the key. He listened to Yahushua. So we can see the exact same thing that's happening back then. Religious tolerance is happening today. We saw all this the other night. Paul was all things to all people. Do you know what being all things to all people means? Being all things to all people is to be as they are.
Let them have it.
Let them have it. Yeah. Let them have it. Accept them. Be as they are. If they're laughing, laugh with them. If they're sad, be sad, be sad. It means being sensitive to the situation. Knowing how people feel in the room that you're in, and being sensitive to it, not judging, but discerning and, letting everybody have it. That's what Paul did. To the Jews, he was one thing. To the Gentiles, he was another thing. To the intellectuals, he was another thing. I'm sure he could sound pretty intellectual if he wanted to. Paul was all things to all people, speaking as they did, with a genuine message from the heart for the heart, not merely stroking the social intellect. This isn't a head knowledge, memory, situation, movement. Yahushua's not like that. He's straight into the heart. So there's just some reminders of what we've been talking about the last few weeks. That's why we need to have our spiels and packages together. There's just some examples there of, and you tailor it to different people. You don't have it memorized and you do the same thing to every person. You listen to Yahushua's voice and he'll guide you. So that is the message tonight, guys. Paul's dealing not only with the Jews, but he's dealing with the Gentiles too, and now he's dealing with the intellectual so-and-sos. But you can see he handles it. He doesn't back down. He doesn't get discouraged. He keeps going, as we must. So, would anybody like to add anything before we close?
I thought it was like interesting and like stupid how they have like a big thing that just says like deity unknown. It's like, why would they put her up like that if
Just in case we've missed one.
yeah.
Mm. Oh. Yeah, it's stupid, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is what Paul's dealing with. Alright guys, you want to close the meeting for me, Joe?
We love you so much, Risha. Thank you for being here tonight with us, to listen to us as we praise you.
Mm.
Thank you for always staying with us and not leaving us. And we're just thankful for that you're always with us. I'm so sorry for all the things that we've done against you and your word.
Mm.
We just love you so much. So be it.
So be it. Beautiful. Wonderful, guys.
Thank you, Matt. That was great.
Oh, pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure. That whole, there's a section there that said, come out from among them and don't touch anything unclean. That's going to come up again on Saturday night, where it says, come out from among them. Don't have anything to do with them. Obviously, behaviourally and within yourself. Obviously, you've got to live and function in the world, but you don't live as them. Yeah.
I dare you to be happy. Hit it. What does it take? Stop me making the same mistake. Now I see it's not me. What a fool I've been. Yeah, yeah. And I'm not ashamed. And everybody can play that game. It's okay, it's one way, and we all survive. Talk about my freedom, talk about my love, talk about my living, and I know that's not enough. I just want my freedom, I just want to love, I just want to know that I can have a little fun. Oh, I dare you to be happy. Oh, I dare you to be happy, yeah. Go figure it out. Oh, this is what the world's about. I can tell what the hell, I can be there too. Yeah, yeah. At the end of the day, I'm feeling good and I'm on my way. When in doubt, leave it out. Put your faith in life. Oh, we can talk about freedom. We can talk about love. We can talk about living.